Bonjour et menez-vous. Je m'appelle Ryan Mckern. Welcome back to the Wicked Webs We Weave podcast. And I am your host, Ryan Mckern. Join us weekly for haunted history, true crime, and all things horror. Tonight, venture with me as we discover the hauntings within St. Louis Cemetery, number 1. You never forget the first cemetery you see when coming to New Orleans. You see the pictures in the books and hear the stories of how large the cities of the dead are. Down here there's blocks, street names named after the graves spanning giant portions of the city. My first cemetery ever visited here is St. Louis Cemetery number 1. Nicknamed the City of the Dead by Mark Twain, St. Louis Cemetery number 1 is home to some of the oldest graves and some of the most notorious faces of New Orleans. Just on the outskirts of the French Quarter, it was decreed in August 14th, 1789, under Spanish decree, which would also make this the oldest cemetery in the city, and also known as one of the most haunted cemeteries in the country. St. Louis Cemetery 1 is estimated at 1,700 tombs and over 100,000 deceased interned within its walls and in its grounds. Such notably that even actor Nick Cage has a pyramid tomb, which also inspired the local rock group, the Tomb of Nick Cage, to name their band after. It is still an active gravesite to this day, which isn't any surprise that it is rumored to be very haunted. For over 200 years, there have been reports of having run-ins with the ghost, which calls St. Louis Cemetery number 1 home. Many people have been tempted to try and access the haunted cemetery after dark, to try and make contact with the ghosts which haunt St. Louis Cemetery. I do not recommend this. It is illegal, and this will upset the spirits. Although St. Louis number 1's eerie facade is enticing, you must also have a license guide to even go in these days, due to vandalism on the graves. Even the appearance of the cemetery bolsters the illusions of days gone by, to say nothing of the eerily quiet atmosphere that descends over St. Louis number 1 as dusk falls and night begins its reign. Its age is prominently displayed by the character of the cemetery. Broken shells and cobblestones, dredged from Lake Pontchartrain in the Mississippi River, form the alleys, and the crumbling, chipped above-ground crypts hold the dead. The disorderly layout of the tombs and burial plots are a labyrinth that only ghosts of the cemetery are able to navigate. Many of the family tombs bear cryptic symbols, as well as signs of vandalism and old age. It is no wonder that so many people feel a ghostly presence when visiting New Orleans' oldest cemetery. And it is no wonder that many movie productions practically ache to film within the cemetery's white walls. Although Easy Rider and Interview with the Vampire are perhaps the most famous films shot inside by far. A crumbling appearance dusted with age, St. Louis number 1 earned the nickname the Cities of the Dead. A more appropriate name has never been given. But which ghost still calls St. Louis number 1 home? and which ghosts are still making their presence known today. And why is St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 haunted? After all, we have found that despite popular belief, cemeteries tend not to be very haunted. After all, when you die, we're sure that there are at least 100 more places to hang out than in a cemetery in which you are buried. Despite this, for almost 200 years, ghost stories have surrounded St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. People have had encounters with the dead who are still buried inside the stone walls of this historic cemetery. So, what can explain the number of ghost sightings in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1? The biggest reason is that people want to see ghosts there. It's a facet of human nature, that if you want to see something badly enough, you're probably going to see it. Or perhaps under the surface, the spirits do linger. I know for myself, working in the French Quarter, namely at Reverend Zombie's Voodoo shop and Marie Laveau's House of Voodoo, you could feel the spirits just walking through not only the building, but everywhere around you. After all, there's hundreds of years of history, lives come and gone throughout the entire city of New Orleans. And if you've fallen in love with New Orleans like I have, then it's no doubt that these spirits are still hanging out and partying. Once we eliminate any paranormal experiences that can be chalked up to overacting imaginations, we still have a large pool of ghost sightings and paranormal experiences to look at. Who are the ghosts still lingering in this haunted cemetery? Let's take a look at some of the most famous people to haunt these hallowed grounds. St. Louis Cemetery has been around for almost 300 years. In that time, untold numbers of people have been laid to rest here. So when trying to answer the question of who is buried in St. Louis No. 1, you'll find yourself trying to answer a question which is almost impossible to answer. It could be almost anyone. However, there are a few ghosts which are seen at here more often than in others. In these cases, we have a pretty good idea who they are. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 is one of the 3 graves unmarked that is said to have held Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen. The most famous within St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 is that of Marie Laveau, commonly known as the Voodoo Queen. Marie was born in 1801 and would become the most revered and at times feared voodoo practitioner in New Orleans history. Do not believe the American Horror Story Coven. By the way, that's very fabrications. Marie used her powers for good. She practiced fortune-telling, the occult, and worked with herbal remedies. As awareness of Marie's skills and power spread throughout the population, her fame grew and gained unimaginable strength. Legend had that she knew all of the secrets in all the levels of society. No doubt she did. Sorts of people fawned over her, begging for her to help them with their problems, or to assist them in their own rituals and spells. She was, quite literally, the go-to voodoo practitioner in New Orleans during the 19th century. Marie was even seen burning sage, smudging the walkways in the Quarter and New Orleans throughout during the Yellow Fever. The ghost of Marie Laveau has been spotted in many locations throughout the French Quarter, including meandering down the street past her old house at 1022 St. Anne Street. She's most recognized by the red and white turban tucked in her hair, and by the brilliantly colored clothes she wears. But even as people follow her, she disappears, vanishes, right from sight, within the cemetery. Individuals have reported seeing the ghost of Marie Laveau walking through the tombs, and for those willing and risking to disregard her or her beliefs or religion, reports exist of people being scratched, pinched, or shoved down to the ground. Marie, as they say, is not always deemed the friendliest of spirits. Show respect to the spirits within their walls and their town, and you shall be okay. Perhaps most interesting of all is that the practice of marking the tomb of Marie Laveau with its 3 X's while asking her for a favor or making a wish. The legend has, truly just a legend, that if the wish is granted, the person is required to return and place a gift at the site of her tomb. Unfortunately, this has led to a lot of vandalism, including 2 instances when the entire tomb was painted a Pepto-Bismol pink after someone had scaled the wall of the cemetery after dark. The result was the Archdiocese of New Orleans closing the cemetery off to the general public after March 5th, 2015. And please do not mark the graves, any graves for that matter, with the X's. Even the changed policy has not stopped guests from experiencing something otherworldly at Marie Laveau's tomb. Visitors reported all sorts of paranormal happenings while trying to interact with the now deceased Voodoo Queen, who lived to be a very old age and helped and blessed many people, and was even good friends within the Catholic Church. People also reported feeling of being touched, becoming unexplainably ill, and hearing voices emanating from inside the tomb. They've all said to happen on occasions. As a courtesy, if you do visit the tomb of Marie Laveau, please do not leave marks of any kind. It is vandalism and must be stopped in order to preserve this historic yet haunted location in New Orleans. Plus, knowing that Marie is capable, do not face the wrath. Put love into the universe and you shall receive love back. Other ghosts of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 include the spirit of Henry Vaines. The story of Henry Vaines is a tragic, sad one. As a sailor during the 19th century, Henry had no true home to speak of. He was a nomad, traveling here and there, sailing on the high seas in New Orleans. He made his home at a local boarding house, but he was constantly worried about his important papers while away from the Crescent City. So much so that, departing onto another voyage, he asked the owner of the boarding house to keep his papers if he died. These papers included his family tunes. The owner of the boarding house promised Henry that all would be well. "You have nothing to worry about," she exclaimed upon his departure. But all was not well. While Henry was at sea, the owner had sold Henry's family tomb. He discovered her treachery when he returned to New Orleans. Poor Henry Vignes was never able to rectify the problem, legally or in his own terms. Shortly after his return, he fell ill and died. But as his tomb had been sold, there was no money to build another. Henry's body was thus buried in an unmarked grave in the paupers section of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. Although his body was laid to rest over a century ago, the ghost of Henry Vignes is still seen wandering the cemetery. He is described as being tall with blue eyes. So corporeal it does not appear that visitors of the cemetery have actually spoken with Henry's ghost. Strolling up to tourists, the apparition asks if they know where the Vignes tomb is located, for he is having trouble finding it himself. Allegedly, Henry's ghost has even been turned up in funerals, appearing behind the grieving to ask if there might be any more room in the tomb for him. His apparition has been caught on camera. So has the distinct sound of a male's voice on an EVP proclaiming, "I need to rest." For the ghost of Henry, it does not seem that rest has ever come easy, or that it ever will. Another lost ghost haunting St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 is that of Alphonse. Like Henry, it seems that the spirit of Alphonse is only hoping to find a place to rest his soul. His spirit has been known to take a visitor's hand in his as he pulls them to a stop. Smiling wildly, he asks them to bring him home. But what home is it that he speaks of? that remains unknown, though his apparition has been seen gathering the flowers off of other graves and placing the offerings on his tomb. It is thought that Alphonse may have been murdered or betrayed by someone of the Pignat family, for every time a visitor steps near the Pignat family tomb, Alphonse appears to warn them to stay away. What story exists there? It seems that it will forever have to remain with Alphonse, the ghost who only wants to find his way home. Upon visiting St. Louis No. 1 Cemetery in New Orleans, it's well worth the visit. I highly recommend it. Visitors have witnessed phantom figures, including the ghosts of Civil War soldiers, and perhaps even the victims of the yellow fever epidemics that killed thousands of New Orleanians almost every summer. The ghosts of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 are numbered in the hundreds, which only makes sense because tens of thousands of people have buried in this lot. Many of the identities of the ghosts which haunt the cemetery will never be known or even discovered, but as they stalk the labyrinth of the tomb in the night and even in the day, it's safe to say that this legendary cemetery has earned its spots as one of the most haunted burial sites in all of America. Even the world chess champion, to say one of the best in the world to ever have played the game, according to Bobby Fischer, is also buried within St. Louis 1. Now, I've done some research, and it said that the starting price for a plot in St. Louis No. 1 is $40,000. I would imagine that inflation has raised, as if the real estate is quite expensive in that cemetery, and being also one of the most famous in New Orleans. But come by, leave an offering, coins in the graves, or at one of the altars around town for Marie Laveau. Sing the song of Dr. John of Marie Laveau. Light some sage, and follow us into these brilliant cities of the dead. Thank you again for joining me for the Wicked Webs We Weave podcast. I am your host, Ryan Mckern. I'd like to thank the following for research on today's episode: NolaGhost.com, TheLineup.com, AllThatIsInteresting.com, Strange Louisiana, the book and novel, GhostCityTours.com, and the Grim Collective YouTube page. Join me next week for another tale of the macabre and haunted. Enjoy your Halloween month, and until next time, au revoir.